Chapter 13. Sniffer update at Newshound. Drinking hot toddies with delegates in bar after. Romp in snow. Impressed with wolf-friendly exit/entrance system. Admires ingenuity. Kate worried about getting the mission statement finished, but as Duncan had raved on about the wonders of playing in the snow, she'd had a thought. He'd said that shifting hadn't been a priority for him recently. Encouraging him to do that now would remind him of the joys to be found as a wolf, joys he could only share with others of his kind. She walked over to the desk and pressed the button to close the drapes. I don't know if anyone's out there, but no reason to take a chance they'd see us taking our clothes off. Good thinking. Duncan pulled off his sweatshirt. Before we shift, you should probably show me how we navigate from the third floor. I assume there's some sort of passageway leading down there that we can access in wolf form. The other rooms have sloping passageways and revolving doors at the bottom, but the exits from my suite and Grandma Elizabeth's are a bit more sophisticated than that. She loved showing this off and she didn't get many chances. Walking to the bookcase closest to the window wall, she pushed what looked like a knothole, a carefully matched rectangle of wood the size of a light switch slid back to reveal a control panel with a touchscreen. Pressing her thumb to it, she heard the click of a latch. Then she placed her hand against the bookcase and it revolved slowly in response. I like it already. Like something out of a murder mystery. Wait until you see the rest. Inside was a small platform and beyond that stood a magnificent glass elevator. The tall panels were etched with scenes of mountains, forests, and wolves. When Kate uttered the voice command of wolf, the elevator pulsed with a silvery light. That's beautiful. Still wearing his t-shirt and jeans, Duncan walked over to peer at the elevator. I assume it has a touchpad inside the elevator we can operate after we've shifted. I can operate it. It recognizes my thumb or paw print, and my grandmother's. Of course. It's the smoothest ride you'll ever have in an elevator. My grandfather had these built a couple of years before he died after Elizabeth complained about the drafty, poorly lit passageways. He had those redesigned, too, so they're much nicer, but he wanted to do something special for his mate. This is bloody damn special, all right. Grandpa Mitchell told her that now she could descend from their suite like an angel from heaven, and he wasn't being sarcastic either. He adored her. Obviously he did, judging from this elevator, but why build a second one down here? This suite was Penny's back then. She was being groomed to be the next alpha. So my grandfather thought she might as well get the royal treatment too. She gave up a lot to be with the man she loved, didn't she? Kate met his gaze. Yes, she did. I would say she gave up too much, but how do I know? I've never been in love like that. I keep thinking though that if she'd never met Tom, none of this would have happened. You don't think she was destined to meet him? She studied him, intrigued by his comment. Do you believe in that? Lovers destined to be with each other. She'd always thought males were more inclined to be practical in such matters. If one female didn't work out, another would be along soon enough. Don't you? I asked you first. Then yes, I do, lass. But you have to remember that I'm a Scotsman. We tend to give a little more credit to fate than you might over here. I think I like that about you. It's very appealing. He laughed. I'm glad, because it's bred into me and I'd be hard-pressed to root it out. So, since you're now in this suite, I take it that you are being groomed for the alpha job. Nothing's been said in so many words because my grandmother, as you can tell, is still fully capable of leading the Stillman pack. But I believe I'm next in line, and this suite is meant for that purpose. Neil would love to push me out of line and move in, literally, but I don't plan to let him. Good. He'd make a terrible pack alpha, but you? He gazed at her with warmth in his gray eyes. You'd be terrific. That's nice of you to say, considering that we don't agree on much of anything when it comes to the future of Wers. Neil seems to be leaning in your direction, though. He doesn't strike me as a Wer with much integrity. You do, and I'd rather see someone honest be in power than someone who thinks like me, or at least pretends to. He grinned at her. But enough of that. Ready to shift and go? You still have all your clothes on, milady. So I do. Walking over to the red sofa, she started stripping down. She'd taken off everything but her bra and panties when he cleared his throat. On the other hand, she glanced over at Duncan. You haven't been undressing while I did. What's the deal? He stood very still, his gaze hot. Maybe there are other easier ways to refill the well. Don't go changing the plan, Woofer. You said you wanted a run in the snow. And that's what we're going to have. She was determined now. He probably spent far too much time as a human. He was losing touch with his roots. Take the rest of your clothes off and be snappy about it. He shrugged. I suppose I'll have to do that regardless. Reaching over his shoulders with both hands, he grabbed fistfuls of his t-shirt, yanked it over his head and tossed it aside. You'll soon see the condition you've put me in by taking off yours. Now it was her turn to stare. She wondered if she'd ever get used to the sight of that broad chest dusted with dark hair and abs that rippled as he pulled off his t-shirt. She swallowed. I see what you mean. And the sight of an aroused Duncan created an almost unbearable need to join with him now, this very minute. But she reminded herself that he needed to rediscover the joys of being a wolf. He might have forgotten what he'd be giving up if he mated with a human who couldn't share that pleasure with him. That red sofa looks cozy. He started toward her. No, she backed around it, putting the sofa between them. We're going to shift and ride that elevator down to the ground floor. That was the plan, and we're going to work the plan. I don't know what will happen if I shift when I'm like this. He gestured toward his groin. I'm not sure it's safe. You'll be fine. Stay right there. I'm going to take off my bra and panties, and then we'll shift together. If you say so, but I think when you take off your underwear I'll be in even worse shape. I seem to have a Pavlovian response to seeing you naked. That's funny, considering Pavlov did his experiments with dogs. It's hilarious, isn't it? I'm standing here getting harder by the second and you think it's funny. I also think it's flattering. And you're not the only one who has a Pavlovian response, just so you know. Ah. He looked mollified. Now that you mention it, I can tell by that delicious scent of yours. I was so preoccupied with my own lust that I failed to take note of yours. His glance swept over her. And your nipples are tight as little pencil erasers. That makes me feel better. She kicked away her panties. That's it. I'm ready. Me too. Let's do it on the sofa. We're not shapeshifting on the sofa. We'd fall off. My wee man has in mind a different activity. She ignored that comment. When was the last time you shifted with a female? We're Duncan. It's been a while. Years. Maybe. So putting it off for another year is no problem. He held out his hand. Lie with me on that red sofa, Kate. I promise to make it worth your while. You've completely lost direction, Woofer. She held out her hand to walk around the sofa and lie here on the carpet with me. We're going to shift together. There's something very special about sharing that moment with another. Or have you forgotten? He hesitated and then he frowned. Perhaps I have. It's been a long time since I've done that. He sighed and rounded the sofa. So if you insist. I do. I think it's important. Dropping to her hands and knees, she lay on her side and stretched out on the soft gray surface. Then she patted a spot beside her. Lie here. I'm still hard as a billiard cue. Harder even. I know. Trust me, you'll be fine. And you'll thank me later. He held her gaze as he came down to lie facing her. He was close enough to reach out and touch her, but he didn't. I just hope that shifting in this condition doesn't cause me to break something important. She pressed her lips together to keep from laughing. He wouldn't appreciate that. If I thought you were in danger of breaking something important, I wouldn't be encouraging you. I do care what happens to you and your important parts. He smiled into her eyes. Same here, lass. She felt a rush of tenderness for this although he'd given her an argument just now, at last he lay facing her, prepared as she was to be, completely vulnerable for the next few seconds. During a shift, a werewolf was defenseless. Trusting each other now would forge a bond. It always did. And maybe that bond would help them bridge the gap between them when they returned to human form. Gazing into his eyes, she concentrated on bringing out the wolf that lived within her and waited patiently to be released. Duncan was a little rusty, but looking into Kate's blue eyes helped him focus. He sensed her energy flowing through her, a luminous river of change. He felt the hum of it in his own body as her vibrations spread across the space between them and washed over him in a calming wave. Yes, he'd forgotten the sensation of peace and wholeness that shifting with it were female could bring. He'd missed the feeling without knowing he missed it. But now that he was here with Kate, he welcomed the shared warmth of moving together into another state of being. His breathing synchronized with hers. As her body began to glow, he held his hand in front of his face and watched the light enter his fingers. She smiled and held her hand up, palm out. Slowly, he aligned his palm with hers, leaving a centimeter of space between. They did not need to touch to be as one. That was the wonder of it. He denied himself this for too long. He gazed in fascination as the transformation began in her, matched by the stretching and tugging that signaled he was shifting in time with her. Like partners in a dance whose bodies never met, they shimmered and slowly transformed, in unison. He saw her eyes become the incredible blue of a wolf's eyes, and he kept his gaze locked with hers, knowing her change mirrored his. At last she rose to her feet, a blonde wolf with eyes that were Kate's, but different, wilder, shining with a primitive light that beckoned to him. Rejoicing in the lithe strength of his body, he stood, stretched out his muzzle, and touched noses with her. Well done, lass. He'd also missed the telepathic communication only possible between wers. There was an intimacy about it that couldn't be duplicated with a human female. Kate had probably meant for him to notice these things. He'd been the one to suggest this, but she'd pushed it once he had. Now he could see how this fit neatly into her plan to convince him her way was superior to his. She surveyed him from the tip of his nose to the tip of his tail. Too bad you don't dress like this more often, woofer. It suits you. I could say the same about you, lass. How are your important parts? The shift seems to have settled me down some. Good. She glanced toward the elevator. Shall we? I'd be honored to share an elevator with the next Stillman Pack Alpha. After you. She walked ahead of him, her head high. Although she was a large wolf, as all wers tended to be, he was larger. As a human he'd schooled himself not to care about such things, but as a wolf, he liked knowing that he stood a good 5 inches taller at the shoulder. Once they were both inside the elevator, he noticed the control mounted near the floor had 2 touchpads. Does this elevator stop at other floors? That would defeat the purpose of making it exclusive, wouldn't it? This is an express elevator. She placed her paw firmly on the top touchpad and the bookcase wall swung closed and latched with a soft click. When she pressed the bottom one, the elevator started down. He'd never imagined what it would be like to be an angel descending from heaven, but he'd be willing to believe this was a close approximation. The glass cubicle glided with a smoothness that told him the mechanism was flawless and probably worth a small fortune. He thought of a love so deep that it would inspire a were to pay for such an elevator so that his beloved mate could ride from her 3rd-floor suite in luxury. Duncan wished for a love that deep, but he hadn't found anyone who seemed capable of sharing such an intense emotion. Honesty made him amend that. Kate had that ability, but thinking of her in those terms was laughable. They couldn't even seem to write a short mission statement together. The elevator slid to a graceful stop and a different side of it slid open. When it did, a section of the dark wall in front of them swiveled, letting in a blast of frigid air. Duncan had second thoughts. Her suite was cozy and warm. They'd let the fire die down, but they could easily build it up again. A wrought iron log holder by the hearth contained a good supply of firewood. He nudged her shoulder. It's cold out there. Maybe this is a bad idea. We've come this far. We're going out there. In one bound she cleared the elevator and leaped through the opening. He had no choice but to follow. As he sucked in a lungful of cold air, he wondered what he'd been thinking. Fresh air was one thing, but this air was the equivalent of a stroll through a meat locker. You're lagging behind, woofer. One thing about Kate, she knew how to taunt him. Bracing himself against the bite of the wind and the chill of the snow under his paws, he gathered his haunches under him. Race you to the ski slope. And he started running through the snow. He threw up plumes of the white stuff each time his paws touched down, dug in, and launched him forward again. About 2 minutes into that exercise he began to have the time of his life. Shifting was a magical experience, but this was what wolves were meant to do. He couldn't believe he'd let so much time go by without racing across the open countryside, his cares forgotten as he abandoned himself to being a wild creature again. A spray of snow hit him in the nose and he turned to find her running beside him. She kept up with his furious pace as if she had no trouble doing that. He put on a burst of speed that should have left her well behind him, but no, she was still there, matching him stride for stride. He shot her a challenging glance as he started uphill along the row of lights. On the ski slope, a climb like this should slow her down, but it didn't. If anything, she was pulling ahead of him. His male pride was in serious danger of being damaged at this rate. Lungs burning, he ran faster. She kept up and she was barely panting, but his tongue hung out like a wet pink dish rag. Fortunately, he didn't need breath to send her a telepathic message. What are you, an Olympic medalist? No, I'm a were who lives above 5,000 feet. You, on the other hand, live at sea level or near to it, I'm guessing. My endurance is bound to be better. Why didn't you mention that? I didn't know I was in a losing battle. Is this a race, Duncan? You know it is, lass. You and I, we've been battling for months. It's become a habit for us. He veered off the slope and into the tall pines lining the ski run. But I'm throwing up the white flag. You bested me and I'm willing to admit that you have. He glanced over his shoulder to see if she followed, and to offer a silent invitation. She swerved, cutting a new path through the snow parallel with his. You had a good time, though. Don't tell me you didn't. I would have had a better time if I'd been able to show off my athletic prowess like the mighty Scotsman that I am. He was poking fun at himself, and he thought she knew him well enough to realize that. But so soon into their relationship, he wasn't quite sure. Just keeping up with me and my superior lung power proves that you are indeed a mighty Scotsman. I can alert Angela Sapworthy to that fact if you like. He snorted. So she'd taken his little joke and turned it back on him. I don't think we want Angela to know about our midnight run, do you? He sank into deeper snowdrifts, too deep for what he had in mind. He required firmer footing, but the ski run wouldn't work. Far too bright. The less Angela knows about anything, the better. Then he spotted it. A small shelter under the overhanging branches of a giant evergreen. The branches had caught the bulk of the snow, which meant the area under them had gathered only a few inches. Let's rest over here. There's shelter from the wind. And shelter from prying eyes? But she followed him, ducking under the branches as he did. That little problem I had before we shifted hasn't entirely disappeared. He walked in a tight circle, trampling the snow a little more. I didn't expect it would. As I recall, it was more than a little problem. Looked like a rather large problem to me. That's nice of you to say. He faced her and stretched his front legs in a playful bow. I'm hoping for your assistance in taking care of that problem. He suspected that initiating were sex would fall right in with her plans. She'd want him to reacquaint himself with that too. As it happened, he was willing to fall in with her plans. He had a strong urge to do so, in fact. One could even say he had a compelling urge that made him circle her as he drew in her musky scent. But being Kate, she wasn't going to make this easy for him. She bounded to the edge of the snowy enclosure. Why should I? Because you want it as much as I do. Maybe I do and maybe I don't. She pranced to the other side of the clearing, flaunting herself. Maybe I'm too tired after that long run. Tired? You were barely panting. I'm the one who should be ready to drop. Poor Duncan. You need to go back inside and recover. Not yet. He edged closer. She danced away. You're going to make me work for this, aren't you? Have you forgotten? It's more fun that way. He circled her again as his blood ran hotter. She was right. It was more fun. This way. He feinted left and she leaped right, whirling to put herself out of position. With a low growl, he stalked her, and she backed up, eyes glowing in the faint light from the ski slope that filtered through the branches. Come and get me, big boy. I can't believe you said that. Always wanted to. I will get you. It's only a matter of time. He dashed to the right and then whirled back, startling her. With a lightning move he didn't know he had, he mounted her in one swift lunge. Now, I let you catch me. Liar. He thrust deep and she shuddered with pleasure. Maybe she had let him catch her after all. And then all thought disappeared as he lost himself in a wild surge of primitive lust. Needs that hadn't driven him in years drove him. Now, he took her again and again and again. Her soft whimper inflamed him even more, and he thrust harder until he felt her close around him, felt her spasms of release. At last he poured himself into her with a ferocity that left him panting. He'd forgotten. Oh yes, he'd forgotten. But he would never forget again. And the truth shattered all his carefully laid plans. He couldn't live without this. Chapter 14. Sniffer update at Newshound. 2 wolves, 1 blonde as morning, 1 black as night, glimpsed running ski slope after hours. Guess who? Hanky Panky. Kate didn't use her telepathic powers as she rode up in the elevator with Duncan, and neither did he. She didn't need to read his mind to know what he was thinking. He'd immersed himself in the experience, and so had she. And he'd loved it, which created a problem for him. She knew that too. But he wasn't the only one with a problem. She'd achieved her goal of reminding him of his awareness and the joys that sprang from that. She'd also reminded herself of her own awareness and how little she'd been celebrating that recently. Maybe that would explain why this experience with Duncan had been so incredible. That would be nice, because otherwise she might have to face the fact that he was the best thing she'd come across in her entire adult life. If that turned out to be true, they'd created quite a dilemma for themselves. The leader of the Howlers couldn't very well be sweet on the leader of the Woofers and vice versa. That would lead to chaos. Once back in her suite, they stretched out in the same spot behind the sofa where they'd shifted earlier. Their wolf bodies glowed with blue fire as they slowly transformed again. They lay there, not moving, not touching, but their gazes met and held. At last Duncan took a breath that came from deep in his chest and shook his entire body. Thank you, lass. I'm not sure that you should thank me. I should. His mouth curved in a soft smile. We're in a hell of a spot, you and I, but I can't bring myself to regret a minute of my time with you. Or I with you. He reached out and took her hand. We're a couple of smart wares, aren't we? I used to think I was, but I might have outsmarted myself. I know the feeling. He brushed her palm with his thumb. But I also know our personal complications have to take a back seat to that mission statement. Howard's counting on us. Yes, he is. Duncan raised her hand to his lips and kissed each of her fingers in turn. So, let's do that job and then we'll talk. He placed a final kiss against her palm. She shivered, both in reaction to his kisses and the prospect of what they would say to each other once they'd set aside their public duties. Would they agree to give up this special connection or find a way to continue it? She had no answers, and she doubted that he did either. Time to get dressed. Rising to his feet, he helped her up too. I have no chance of concentrating with you looking all rosy and well-loved. Makes me want to do it again. I know. Me too. Holding both of his hands, she stood on tiptoe to give him one gentle kiss. And thank you for loving me so well. Then she squeezed his hands and let go. Gathering her clothes, she turned away and quickly put them on. She didn't glance over at him as they both dressed, much as she would have liked to. She heard the rustling of denim as he put on his jeans and ignored the mental image that brought up. They had a job to do and time was running out. I had a thought about this mission statement, he said. She shoved both arms into the sleeves of her sweatshirt and popped it over her head. What's that? We've both approached with our own agendas. He pulled on his sweatshirt, too, and looked at her. What if we each put those aside and think of what we would write if we weren't trying to insert our personal philosophy into it? You mean lay down our weapons? Something like that. But our constituents are counting on us to defend our respective positions in this mission statement. Kate thought of Heidi, Jake, and especially Sally, with her stealth support. I know, but the entire world isn't divided into woofers and howlers, much as it seems that way right now. What about those who fall somewhere in between? Don't we owe them a mission statement they can be happy with too? She thought about that. You have a point. Let me put on some more coffee to wake us up. She walked over to the kitchen where the bare soles of her feet met cool tile. Even the smell of the coffee beans as she ground them helped her focus. She dumped the ground coffee in the basket, filled the reservoir with water, and turned on the switch. Got anything sweet to go with it? She narrowed her eyes at him. I wasn't trying to be cute. I'm looking for cookies, cake, pie, brownies. That'd be perfect, lass. She dug around in the refrigerator and came up with a tin of brownies she kept on hand for long nights at the computer. She was ridiculously pleased by his happy smile as she opened the tin and set it on the counter where he could reach it. She liked seeing that smile. He reached for a brownie and rebooted his laptop. Let's take a look at each of our mission statements again. There have to be core elements that aren't weighed down by our agendas. He gazed at the screen. So here's how you start. Out nice and neutral to support the werewolf culture worldwide. I'm okay with starting that way. Obviously I am, since I wrote it. Walking around the end of the counter, she stood beside his stool and looked at the two statements, his above hers. Then let's take that part and start over. He copied her opening words down below. What else is important? Individuals, she said. How about, and the interests of each individual? He glanced over at her. That's bloody brilliant. It leaves room for words to choose their own path instead of dictating one. I'm going to move the placement of worldwide. So we have to support the werewolf culture and the interests of each individual worldwide. Throughout the world. I like that better than worldwide. The coffee's done. I'll get us each a cup. When she returned, he typed in the change and was looking at the statement. He held out his hand and she put the cup into. He sipped his coffee without taking his eyes from the screen. What comes next? She snagged a brownie from the tin and took a bite. I'm not sure anything comes next. He looked over at her. I think that might be it. She read the sentence aloud. To support the werewolf culture and the interests of each individual throughout the world. It's very simple. Is it too simple? It's not too simple. That's the beauty of it. It allows for protection if that's needed and for change if that's needed. Everything this organization decides to do can be held up against this statement. Does it support the werewolf culture and the interests of each individual throughout the world? Does great. If it doesn't, then back to the drawing board. She drank her coffee and studied the wording. After all this, can it be so easy? It can once we each stop trying to push our particular program. I wonder if the woofers and howlers will be disappointed in it. He shook his head. They can't be. As I said, it leaves the door open for more protection and isolation or for more openness and change. But it addresses the most important consideration to support the culture in each other. Nobody can argue against that. She laughed. Oh, I'm sure someone will. Maybe not if we sell it right. You and I don't have to give up campaigning for what we believe. In fact, we can campaign even harder to try to prove that our particular belief system fits the mission statement. Howard doesn't want the howlers and woofers to be divisive forces. Duncan took another brownie. That's where you and I come in. We tell our followers that we support the mission statement which we came up with together, and we intend to hold all our actions, woofers and howlers alike, up to that yardstick. If the debate gets too negative, then it won't support the werewolf culture or the individuals in it, right? She smiled. Right. You really are smart, woofer. Not so smart. He looked into her eyes. I still haven't any idea what we're going to do about us. She glanced at the time showing in the bottom right of his screen. I don't have a long-term solution, but I have a short-term one. Heat flickered in his gray eyes. Is that so? We finished before dawn. She walked back around the counter and turned off the coffee pot. And between the night we've had and the coffee I just drank, I'm too wired to sleep. I like where this is going. She chuckled. I was pretty sure you would. Don't forget to save that document before you come to bed. With that she winked at him and began flicking off the lights. They'd worked hard and they'd worked well. They deserved a reward. Despite the anticipation zinging through his system, Duncan carefully saved their mission statement in a new document. Then he even went to his briefcase, took out a flash drive and backed it up. All of that was probably unnecessary and the wording should stay in his head anyway, but he wanted to be sure nothing got lost in the shuffle. Light from her bedroom beckoned him, and he pulled off his sweatshirt as he walked toward it. We don't have the authority to release the mission statement yet, but I'm going to write a quick blog before I go down to the conference in the morning to say I support it and the work we did tonight. He expected some response and got none. Kate, would you rather I didn't? So then, the rest of his sentence went unsaid as he stood in the doorway and stared. She sat propped up against a bank of pillows, totally naked and totally engrossed in his book. He stood there a moment so he could etch the scene in his memory. He might need to take it out later to lift his spirits on some cold gray day in Glimbara. Surely no reader of his book had ever looked as sexy and lovely as this while turning the pages. She caught her lower lip between her teeth and then she chuckled and turned the page. He'd made her laugh. That was worth more than 50 rave reviews on the internet. She didn't even agree with him, and yet she'd laughed at something he'd written. Because she'd just begun the book, she must be reading his description of the first time he had to use a condom because he was having sex with a human female, and she quite rightly insisted on it. At one point she laughed so hard she had to stop and wipe the tears from her eyes. Then she went right back to reading. He'd hooked her. He wondered how long he could stand here before she'd noticed that he hadn't joined her in the bedroom. He couldn't decide whether to be flattered that she liked the book so much or depressed because the book seemed to be taking his place very nicely. In a way, he was competing with himself for her attention. But watching her lying there in her big comfy bed soon produced a now familiar effect on his cock. He walked into the room. "You seem to be enjoying that." She glanced up, as if surprised to find the author himself, an aroused author, at that standing by her bed. Then her gaze lowered to his pride and joy, and she grinned. "I almost wish I had a condom so I could see if you've improved your technique." "I have." He climbed into bed with her and closed his hand over the open book. "But you make a good point about not bothering with one." He started to lift the book out of her hands. She gripped it tight. "Don't do that. You'll lose my place. Then we'll just turn down the corner of the..." "Don't." She jerked the book away. "You will not dog-ear a page on my personally autographed book." Her blue eyes flashed. "Are you a dog-ear kind of reader?" "I suppose I've dog-eared a page or two in my day." He decided not to admit it. Was his usual habit. She rolled to the far side of the bed and opened a drawer. "Then remind me never to loan you one of my books." She took a metal bookmark out of the drawer. "This is how civilized readers mark their place." She inserted the bookmark and laid the book on the nightstand. "I'm honored that you're taking such good care of my book, lass. But there's more where that came from. I had several boxes of them shipped to the hotel last week." "I know." She scooted around and sat cross-legged, facing him. "I took delivery, which makes me doubly ashamed that I didn't read it before now. But I don't want one of those books. I want the one you gave me." He was touched by that more than he wanted to let on. Only an idiot would miss the fact that she was starting to care for him, and he was starting to care for her a great deal. He probably needed to figure out some potential solutions for them, but he'd had a very long day and thinking wasn't so easy. When confronted with the naked Kate, he lay on his side, his head propped on a pillow, and just looked at her. In a moment he would do more than look, but for now he wanted to be still and appreciate the pink and gold beauty of her. Her hair curled around her creamy shoulders, tousled and shining in the light from the bedroom lamps. Lower still, a golden triangle of curls nearly covered her treasures, but because she sat cross-legged, she revealed a glimpse of pink perfection. His cock twitched. Perhaps the time for looking was over. But he hesitated because she seemed to be engaged in the same sort of study. Her gaze roamed up from his toes, lingered gratifyingly on his erection, and then traveled onward until she reached his eyes. "I can't decide," she said. Now there was a statement to worry any male with his heart set on seduction. "I hope you're not referring to whether we'll have sex or not. Personally, I'm quite decided on that, and in the affirmative, I might add." She smiled. "Oh, me too." That restored his good humor in a hurry. "Then what can't you decide on? Maybe I can help. I can't decide if I like you better this way or as a wolf. State your preference and I'll be happy to oblige." He'd do handstands and somersaults too if it would get him what he wanted, which was his cock buried up to the hilt between her silky thighs. "I don't want you to shift now." She reached out and grasped the very part of him he was most happy to have her hold on to. "That would take too long." She caressed him. At her touch, his eyes nearly rolled back in his head. "That's very nice. Very nice indeed. You look happy. Every inch of me is overjoyed. Especially that part you're stroking right now." He caught her wrist. "But if you're not careful, I'll become a little too happy, and that would make us both sad." He nibbled on her fingers before tugging gently on her wrist. "Lie down for me, lass. I fancy a tumble." Laughing, she unfolded her legs and slid down beside him. "You fancy a tumble? That sounds as if you're about to throw me down on a pile of hay and flip up my petticoats. What a picture." He rolled on top of her and quickly braced himself on his forearms and knees so he wouldn't crush her as he'd done the night before. "I wouldn't mind trying that someday." He leaned down and kissed her long and thoroughly before lifting his head to see the effect of that kiss. Her flushed skin and rapid breathing told him all he needed to know. We'd have to find a pile of hay though. She ran her hands lightly up and down his back. And I'd have to wear petticoats. He moved between her thighs, with nothing on underneath. She quivered beneath him. Sounds rather scandalous, but rather necessary. Otherwise I can't do this. Holding her gaze, he thrust deep. Her breath caught and her pupils grew large and dark. Note to self. She gasped again as he drew back and shoved home a second time. Nothing under petticoats. At least when I'm around. He began a slow, steady rhythm, and a hum of pleasure rose unbidden from deep in his throat. She clutched his hips and lifted to meet each stroke. And when you're not around, a nicely fitted chastity belt would do fine. He smiled to show her he was teasing. Sort of. Not really. He didn't want to think of another male pumping away between her thighs. I see. She smiled back. He was afraid she did see that he was besotted and aching to claim her. And he could not, for more reasons than he could count, if he even had the ability to count right now, which he didn't. But he could do this. He could love her with all that was in him and hope that she knew that what he couldn't say, what he couldn't promise, was still there, hovering just beyond his reach. Maybe someday he'd find a way to grasp it. In the meantime, he'd gaze into her blue eyes and watch the climax building there. He'd glory in the heat between them, the urgency of her touch, the satisfaction of plunging into her over and over. Her lips parted and she arched upward, her body asking silently for more. He shifted slightly and began to pound faster. Yes. She clutched him tight as the ride became wild, wilder than any he'd known. Oh, Duncan, yes, yes. Ah, my sweet lass. My Kate. He watched the fire in her eyes as she came, and then he let her witness the fire in his as he spilled his seed within her. He could not say the words, but he thought she knew. Oh yes, she knew. What they would do about it was for another time. He kissed her tenderly, eased away from her, and then drew her spoon-fashion into his arms. She sighed and nestled against him. So that was a tumble. It was. I liked it, even without the hay and the petticoats. So did I, milady. So did I. She slept then, but he could not. He longed to keep the dawn from breaking, because he had a premonition that once it did, their fragile relationship would come under siege, and he was helpless to stop that from happening. Chapter 15. Werecon 2012. Howler Woofer Battle, Day 2. Exclusive report for Werewolf Celebrity Watch by Angela Sapworthy. Denver. At a magnificent breakfast buffet in the Stillman Lodge's excellent restaurant, howlers and woofers eyed each other with barely disguised animosity as each side worked to recruit members from a sizable number of undecided delegates. But the unanswered question on everyone's minds remains, where are the two leaders of these rival organizations? All attempts to reach them on their cell phones have gone unanswered. This reporter was able to catch a brief moment with newly elected President Howard Wallace to get the inside scoop on the dynamic duo. I told them to isolate themselves in order to craft a mission statement that would apply to the entire group, including howlers, woofers, and those who are neither. Wallace said. Apparently they've done that. I look forward to seeing the results of their hard work. When asked about reports that a blonde and a black wolf had been seen on the ski slope at a very late hour, Wallace seemed unfazed. If it was MacDowell and Stillman out there, they may have needed some fresh air. Whatever they required to get the job done is fine with me. Rumors are flying, however, that the howler and woofer leaders may have a closer relationship than their followers would like. This reporter caught them sharing a cozy moment and a joke in the hallway when most other delegates were attending vital conference sessions. Early this morning, howler sympathizer and council member Jake Hunter was overheard implying that something was going on between MacDowell and Stillman. Yet when asked about his suspicions, the gallant were refused to comment. In this reporter's opinion, a refusal to comment speaks more loudly than words. As the minutes ticked by with no sign of MacDowell or Stillman, the evidence mounts that we're not getting the whole story. But never fear, Sapworthy's here. Watch this spot for breaking news or follow me on Sniffer at Newshound as I sniff out the truth. Kate woke up with a start, glanced at the clock and groaned. Let's roll. Woofer. We're late. In the bed beside her, Duncan lifted his head. What time is it? 8:30. We've missed the breakfast buffet, but we might just make the opening session if we hurry. She slid out of bed and combed her hair back from her face. You'd better head down to your room. We'll each get ready. Faster that way. Aye. He climbed from the opposite side of the bed, yawned, and stretched his arms over his head. I didn't think I'd sleep at all, but I must have drifted off. He was truly magnificent, with the body and chiseled features of a Grecian god, except for the slight stubble on his chin, which made him all the more real and adorable to her. As she looked at him across the expanse of the rumpled sheets, she wished with all her heart that they had nothing to do but hop back into that bed and spend the day there, or shift and run in the snow, as they had last night. His sleepy gaze fixed on her. I don't know what today will bring, but whatever happens, I will be thinking about, he gestured toward the bed, about the beauty of what we've had. She was surprised by the sudden lump in her throat. Maybe it's not over. It's not over, lass. But we might be in for some rough sledding today. We might. She took heart from his assurance that this wasn't the end for them. They didn't have time to discuss it now, but he wasn't leaving until the next morning. Time had not run out, not yet. I'll get out of your way now, and I'll see you downstairs. Right. He started out of the room, giving her an excellent view of his tight buns. Oh. He turned back and caught her ogling. His smile was pure masculine satisfaction. Now that will sustain me through the day. I suppose now your ego will swell to twice its normal size. Nay, but if you keep looking at me that way, another part of my anatomy definitely will. Get out of here, woofer, before we both get in trouble. I will, but I wanted to mention about our blogs. I said something last night, but you were too preoccupied with my book and condom story and you didn't hear me. She laughed at the memory. What did you say about our blogs that I totally missed while I was reading about your first condom adventure? I think it would be excellent if we each posted up something in support of the mission statement without saying what it is, of course. It's Howard's decision when he wants to reveal it, but we can do some advance promo and encourage our followers to greet it with an open mind. I won't have time before the opening session. Neither will I, but I'll do it as soon as I get a break. She nodded in agreement. Sounds good. I'll do the same. Good. Go jump in the shower. I'll be gone once I throw on some clothes. She hesitated, unwilling to end what might be a last moment of intimacy between them for hours. Hurrying over to him, she gave him a quick kiss. For luck. He smiled and gave her a return kiss. For the wisdom to navigate this day. Yes, that's probably better than depending on luck. See you soon. Aye. She turned from the bedroom doorway and headed for the shower. This long goodbye could go on forever, and they couldn't afford the time. Don't forget to turn your phone on, he called from the living room. Okay, thanks. She'd left it in her bedside table drawer, turned off as Howard had requested. Pulling it out, she turned it on, tossed it on the bed, and went in to take the quickest shower in history. She just stepped out and grabbed a towel when her phone rang. A sixth sense told her it was Duncan, although she had no reason to believe he'd be calling her so soon. The readout confirmed it. She pushed the button and held the phone to her ear. Miss me already? We've been seen. Seen? When? By whom? Her gut churned. I don't know who saw us, but somebody noticed us running on the ski slope and reported it to Sapworthy. She sent out a sniff sometime during the night, and her first dispatch of the day implies that something's going on between us. But she has no proof. No, it doesn't sound like it. If the howlers and woofers think we're sleeping together, it would affect our credibility, the mission statement, everything. Then we'd better be more antagonistic to each other, both in person and on our blogs. We can't let anyone suspect that we are falling in love. No, we can't. I wanted you to have a heads up. Thank you. See you down there in a few. She disconnected and put a hand to her stomach to try and calm the churning inside. A run through the snow was not the same as having sex, and no one had seen that happen. She and Duncan had been given a tough assignment, so what was so terrible about deciding to shift and take a run through the woods to clear their heads? She knew the answer. It wasn't the run that would raise eyebrows. Everyone would be thinking about the shifting that had to take place prior to the run. Shifting that could only be done after removing all their clothes. They might be leaders of rival organizations, but they were healthy young Wers with normal sexual appetites. No one would believe that stripping down to shift and shifting back to that naked state, all in complete isolation from the rest of the delegates, was done platonically, and their suspicions would be absolutely correct. She had several purple howler shirts, and as she pulled on a clean one, she wondered what sort of reception she'd get from her followers. She didn't feel that she'd betrayed the cause, but they might, in her mind, coaxing Duncan to explore his where nature could reap benefits in the long run, but that might look like a rationalization to others. Still, she had to believe that his beliefs had been affected by their experience together as wolves. He dismissed were sex as no better than, and possibly not as good as, were human sex. Surely he didn't feel the same way this morning. The whole thing was a complicated mess though, and she wasn't sure how much understanding she'd find among her constituents. She wouldn't accept all the heat from this either. Howard had thrown them together to come up with that doggone mission statement. A little voice told her that she should have refused the assignment. If Howard had insisted on having Duncan involved in writing it, then some other howler could have filled in. Giselle, for example, or even Jake. No, not Jake. Duncan and Jake would have come to blows if they'd been forced to work together. But Giselle seemed smart and capable. Kate could have suggested her instead, making up some excuse as to why she couldn't do it herself. No reasonable excuse came to her, but anything would have been better than letting the chips fall where they may. At least they had a mission statement though. She tried to console herself with that as she hurried downstairs for the first session, her laptop in a small briefcase so she could work on her blog during the next seminar. The mission statement was a good one too, although if she and Duncan became the target of gossip, acceptance of the mission statement would be in jeopardy. Damn and double damn. Howard was already at the microphone when she slipped into the room and found a seat in the back. Duncan had made it there ahead of her and sat with his woofers. Once again they had taken the left side of the aisle and the howlers had commandeered the right. Kate gazed at the sea of purple shirts and hoped with all her heart that she hadn't jeopardized the movement she held so dear. Her throat tightened. They'd all been so enthusiastic and loyal. Would they turn on her? Find themselves a new leader? Heidi would stand by her, but she couldn't guarantee that the rest would. Howard greeted the delegates with warmth and friendliness. He was going to make a terrific president even if he did have 2 sons with human wives. Kate thought she'd made progress with Duncan in that respect too. Apparently he'd been viewing the were human mating idea only from the were male's perspective. If she were in the mood for laughing, she'd find that funny. Typical maybe, but funny all the same. Duncan hadn't considered what the dangers would be for a female were who married a human, as Penny had done. But he'd considered them now, and it would affect how he approached the issue in the future. Her close association with Duncan had reaped benefits for the Howler cause, no doubt about it. But she didn't know if she'd get a chance to explain or if she even could explain without sounding defensive. Some might only see that she'd literally slept with the enemy and condemn her as a result. Thanks to my brilliant council members, Howard said, I have 2 exciting proposals for you. The first is a name for our brand new bouncing baby werewolf organization. I present to you the possibility of calling it WOW, Worldwide Organization of Werewolves. The hall fell silent for a couple of seconds, and then someone began to clap. Soon the applause became thunderous and included howling and choruses of woof woof woof. The organization had a name. Even mired down by her personal concerns, Kate realized this was an historic moment. Angela Sapworthy sat 2 rows in front of her, tapping away on her laptop. Kate didn't appreciate the gossip that Angela presented as legitimate news, but at least someone was here recording the event and sending it out into the world. In spite of everything, Kate was glad to be here, to be a witness to the formation of an organization dedicated to making life better for werewolves everywhere. If the mission statement that she and Duncan had worked so hard to create was accepted, she could take pride in being a significant part of this conference. And now for the second exciting development, Howard said. An organization with a terrific name like WOW needs a guiding principle, a mission statement. I'm happy to say that thanks to the dedication and hard work of Howler leader Kate Stillman and Woofer leader Duncan MacDowell, we have such a statement. Are they shacking up or what? Someone called from the crowd. Kate cringed. Dear God, this could be a disaster. Yeah, what's going on between those 2? Someone else shouted. Maybe they need their own group, the Wooflers. The room erupted with accusations from some and ribald jokes from others. At some point Kate had been spotted, and several Wers turned to look at Kate to see how she was taking it. She straightened in her chair and stared them down, although she could feel the heat in her cheeks. Wers, have some dignity. Howard banged the gavel several times on the lectern and eventually the crowd settled again. Let's be clear, he said in ringing tones. I will not tolerate that kind of behavior in an official session of WOW. He fixed his intense gray eyes on the crowd. I agreed to serve as your president because I believe in what we can accomplish together. That requires civil discourse at all times. Another outbreak and I will adjourn this session and disband our council. The delegates muttered among themselves. His jaw set, Howard banged the gavel again. You have an opportunity for greatness today, but you can waste that opportunity by wallowing in petty gossip and innuendo. It's your choice. He continued to glare at the assembled delegates while several squirmed in their chairs. Now Kate understood why Grandma Elizabeth had such faith in Howard Wallace. If anyone could corral this bunch, it would be a Wer like Howard. He hadn't amassed a fortune by being meek, and he hadn't run the Wallace pack through lax leadership. Kate might not agree with the actions of his sons, but she could learn a great deal about being a pack alpha from watching Howard. Then to her surprise, Duncan stood. May I say something, Mr. President? You may, Mr. MacDowell. Kate's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She had no idea what Duncan planned to say. She prayed that whatever it was, he wouldn't make things worse, for himself or for her either. I realize there are a few rumors circulating about the relationship between Kate Stillman and me, Duncan said. That's a bloody shame because there's not a Wer more dedicated to the cause she believes in than Kate. During our brainstorming session last night she fought like a tiger, or I should say, like a wolf, for her principles. Kate's chest tightened with emotion. He was defending her, and that might come back to haunt him. Don't misunderstand, Duncan continued. I fought for my principles too. Neither one of us has abandoned our position. I'm still in favor of openness. And we're human mating, and Kate wants to maintain secrecy and restrict us to where we're mating. Check out our blogs in a couple of hours if you doubt it. Whatever our personal relationship, which by the way is none of your bloody business, we remain fierce opponents in this discussion. She felt attention swing to her once again. He'd tacitly acknowledged that they had a personal relationship. She flushed, but not with shame. She was pleased that he wasn't ashamed of it either, and he'd had the courage to defend their right to privacy. He'd also set the stage for a continuing battle of principles. All in all, she couldn't have asked for a better declaration. But he had more to say. In the end, though, we both realized that the mission statement was separate from our individual agendas. Couldn't be just for woofers or just for howlers. It had to be for all of us, including those who haven't chosen either side. I ask you to listen with an open mind. Thank you. Duncan took his seat amid scattered applause and a few faint woofs. Everyone, it seemed, was now ready to hear this mission statement that Howard was excited about and Duncan vocally supported. Thank you, Duncan. Howard looked pleased. And I want to commend you and Kate for your fine work. I asked you to put aside your allegiances, and you have. I will now read the proposed mission statement as crafted by Duncan MacDowell and Kate Stillman. Worldwide Organization of Woofers Mission Statement: to support the werewolf culture and the interests of each individual throughout the world. Howard glanced up and surveyed the delegates. At first there was silence, and then Jake Hunter stood. I'd like to speak. Howard nodded. Go ahead, Mr. Hunter. There's nothing in there about protecting ourselves. Instead of talking about supporting the interests of each individual, I think we should talk about supporting their safety. Some in this room don't seem to be worried about that, but I for one am. The howlers clapped enthusiastically. Kate braced herself for someone to start a howl going, but Howard's lecture must have subdued her followers somewhat. No howls were forthcoming, and she was relieved. She also felt she should answer his objection. She stood. May I speak in response, Mr. President? Howard nodded. Of course, Kate. She looked at Jake, whose piercing green eyes seemed to take her measure. The stiff set of his shoulders indicated he was disappointed in her. I understand why you would want the word safety instead of interests. I argued for that too. But that word has a connotation that fits the howler message. Duncan lobbied for his favorite buzzwords too. We had to leave them out in order to create a mission statement that worked for everyone. Well, it doesn't work for me. Jake's angry stance didn't change. If this mission statement is adopted, then I'm serving notice right now that I'm starting my own organization, and I'll welcome any howlers who are as unhappy with the direction we're heading in as I am. That's your choice, Kate said. But I'd be sorry to see you do that. She sat down, her stomach churning. Jake had charisma and might very well tear apart the organization she worked so hard to build. Howard spoke into the mic. Are you finished, Mr. Hunter? Yes. I'll wait for the vote. Jake took his seat. Does anyone else want to speak? The room was quiet. In that case, that's all the business we have this morning, Howard said. We're going old school for the vote on this mission statement. Ballots in a ballot box are out in the hall. How do we know it's fair? Called out a woofer covered in anti-howler buttons. Reasonable question, Howard said. The vote will be anonymous, but we know how many delegates we have. We'll count the ballots at 5 this afternoon. There are fewer ballots than delegates, so be it. If there are more, then we'll have to do it all over again during the ball tonight. So don't try stuffing the ballot box. Please. It'll ruin our party. He banged the gavel. We're adjourned. Kate was immediately surrounded by howlers with questions about how the mission statement would affect them. She was grateful that no one, at least so far, had asked about her relationship with Duncan. She did her best to explain to those clustered around her that the mission statement was designed to unify, not divide. But seminars were beginning, and she didn't want the mission statement debate to pull delegates away from scheduled speakers. She announced that she was going to a lecture titled Werewolfs, Enhancing the Basic Position. She'd interviewed the speaker for her book and wanted to support her talk. Because of that, she participated in the discussion and didn't have any down time to write her blog. The second hour, though, she sat in on a session titled Managing Your Offspring's First Shift. Although it was presented by 2 of her followers, the topic wasn't relevant to her yet, so she could sneak some time to write her blog. Choosing her words carefully, she told her followers that voting for the mission statement wouldn't jeopardize their cause. She noticed a few of the howlers glancing at her while she worked. Maybe they thought she should be paying more attention to the speaker, but she didn't have kids yet, so why worry about it now? She posted her blog just as the seminar ended. As she shut off her laptop and stowed it in her briefcase, Heidi rushed into the seminar room, headed straight for her. She looked upset, and so pale her freckles stood out as if they'd been drawn on with a Sharpie. Kate hadn't spoken to Heidi yet this morning, but she couldn't believe this sudden panic had anything to do with the mission statement. Worried that something even worse had happened to her dating site, Kate stood, grabbed her briefcase, and met Heidi halfway across the room. What is it? Duncan's blog. Have you seen it? I haven't had a chance to look, but we both agreed to post something positive about the mission statement. What did he say? He didn't talk about the mission statement, I can tell you that. Heidi pulled out her phone from her purse and clicked a button before turning the phone so Kate could see it. At first Kate couldn't tell what she was looking at, so she magnified the picture and then she gasped. The picture was fake, of course, but someone skilled in Photoshop techniques had managed to make it look as if she lay in bed with the male lead of The Force, her favorite TV actor and most definitely human. The caption was following in her sister's footsteps. Below that, a short blog recounted Penny's choice of a human mate and suggested that Kate was leading a double life by insisting that Wers should only have sex with Wers while she dallied with a human TV star. Kate felt sick to her stomach. No wonder howlers had been looking at her during the seminar. They probably pulled this up on their phones and wondered what the hell was going on. One of her first conversations with Duncan came back with perfect clarity. What's your favorite show? I love The Force. I have a little crush on the guy who plays Adam. She couldn't believe that the same Duncan who'd loved her so thoroughly mere hours ago could have posted this blog, but she'd confessed her fears about her sister last night, and the night before she'd confessed her silly attraction to this TV actor. Swallowing the bile that rose in her throat, she handed the phone back to Heidi. I have to talk to him. Talk to him? How about you, me, and the rest of the howlers lure him into a dark hallway and beat the living shit out of him? How about that? I just can't believe. Let me at least see what he says. What can he say? He's mounted a smear campaign with a photoshopped picture. Some Wers will recognize that, but not all of them. We need to take him out. Heidi quivered with rage. I'm so furious I could do it right now with my bare hands. I don't care if he outweighs me by 100 pounds. Let me at him. But Kate had already pulled out her phone and texted Duncan. How could you post that blog? His response came back almost immediately. We agreed to highlight our differences, remember? Not like that. Kate, I hope you don't expect me to back off from the woofer position because of last night. A cold chill traveled down her spine. You've betrayed me, Duncan. How? If you don't know, then there's no way I could ever explain it to you. A red mist of fury settled over her brain as she looked up from her phone. Beating the shit out of him is too private a punishment, Heidi. I want the whole of cyberspace to know what I think of that slimy bastard. Now you're talking. Let's get out of here. I need to go up to my room and concentrate on this. She nearly crashed into Neil as she stormed out into the hall. Hey, Kate. He caught her arm. Anything wrong? You look furious. She was in no mood to play nice with her cousin. Sorry. No time to talk. Heidi and I have something that needs doing immediately. Adrenaline pumping. She headed for her room with Heidi by her. Chapter 16. Sniffer update at NewsHound blog attack. Just as Werecon 2012 started to bore me, MacDowell and Stillman unloaded on each other. Mesmerized. Knox Trevelyan stopped Duncan in the hallway between sessions. I admire all your work and have always admired your dedication to the woofer cause, but I'm not sure what to think about that blog, buddy. It doesn't sound like you. I wanted to make sure everyone knows where I stand. Duncan went back over the blog he'd written and couldn't see why Kate, and now Knox, objected to it. Oh, you did that all right? And she's responded in kind. Can't say I blame her either. Guess I should take a look at her blog then. He'd written his quickly during the first hour, finished it in about 15 minutes and posted it right away. He thought he'd done a decent job of stating the woofer position, while still supporting the mission statement. Her reaction made no sense. Had their time together convinced her that he would never say anything negative about the howlers again? That was unrealistic and not what he'd expect of her. If I were you, Knox said, I'd issue an apology before this gets any nastier. Nasty. Duncan frowned. I wasn't nasty. Then you and I have different standards. Well, I'm off to another session. Hope you two get this over with before Howard sees it. He'll blow a gasket. Knox headed on down the hallway to one of the meeting rooms. Duncan found a quiet corner with 2 easy chairs tucked into it, sat down and took his laptop out of his briefcase. Something wasn't right. He quickly called up Kate's blog and read it in growing amazement. Open letter to Duncan MacDowell. Dear Sonata Prince Duncan, I made the mistake of thinking that you had a touch of honor in your soul, but your recent actions have convinced me that you have none whatsoever. I also deluded myself that you had a few brains in that swelled head of yours, but apparently that's not true either. Otherwise you'd realize that Wers are intelligent beings who will recognize a smear campaign when they see it. Your opinion of your kind must be exceedingly low if you think they can be duped as you have attempted to dupe them. No wonder you prefer human females. You probably seek out those who are not very bright so that you can amaze them with your supposed brilliance. I, however, have seen the light, and it does not come from you, Duncan MacDowell. All that I see when I look at you is the dark pit of hell. May you spend the rest of your life roasting in it. Kate. A hive of angry bees buzzed in his head. Smear campaign? Duping other Wers? What was she talking about? He called up his own blog and there was the recent post he'd written. Now that he thought about it, everyone wearing a purple shirt had been glaring at him for the past hour, and a few had made some rude gestures too. He'd wondered about that because he hadn't thought his post was the least bit inflammatory. It still wasn't. Sure, he'd restated his belief in ending the secrecy and allowing Wers and humans to mate without fear, but there was nothing insulting about his argument. At some point he'd planned a follow-up blog to acknowledge his new understanding regarding Wer-human mating. A Wer-female mating with a human had a different situation, and he'd planned to invite some comments from his followers on the subject and get a civilized debate going. But now Kate had consigned him to hell. Something was very wrong, but he couldn't find out what it was unless he saw her in person. Taking his phone from his pocket, he texted her. We need to talk. Her response came back quickly. Not in this lifetime. I don't know why you're so upset. Then you're even more stupid than I thought. Please, can I meet you somewhere? No and hell no. He sighed and stared at his phone. This exchange was getting him nowhere. Then, he noted the time. A lunch break would be next, followed by the autograph session featuring him, Kate, and Emma Wallace, Aidan Wallace's mate and a best-selling novelist. Earlier today he'd been looking forward to the autographing as a chance to be in the same room with Kate. After the rumors about them he'd been careful to avoid her, thinking that was for the best until they worked out how they'd proceed. Judging from her blog post, there would be no proceeding at all. Ever. She literally hated him. How could that be? He was thoroughly bewildered and wished she'd been willing to meet him privately to discuss the problem, whatever it was. She hadn't been, but she couldn't duck him forever. They would both be in the room for the autographing, and he'd find a time to get her aside. Bolstered by that thought, he admitted to himself that he was exhausted. He needed sleep more than he needed lunch. Returning to his room, he set his phone alarm, pulled off his clothes, and fell into bed. He was asleep instantly. The alarm woke him 30 minutes before he was due at the autographing. He also had a text from Howard on his phone. Glad you took that terrible blog post down. Don't know if you did it or one of your woofers, but you owe Kate an apology. We can't have this kind of animosity on the council. Muttering a few swear words in Gaelic, Duncan treated himself to a very hot shower and clean clothes. Even though he'd showered this morning, he felt dirty. As he dressed in a black turtleneck, slacks, and a sport coat, he thought of something that didn't match up and quickly checked his blog. His original post was still there, so what did Howard mean about being glad he'd taken it down? If he hadn't known for sure that he was wide awake, he'd think this was some horrible nightmare. But he knew what nightmares felt like, and this was real. Too damned real. He intended to get some answers. The autograph session had been set up in the ballroom because the debate was to follow immediately afterward, and that allowed Duncan and Kate to remain in the same room. Delegates were already lined up outside the door waiting for the autographing to begin. The woofers gave him a grin and a thumbs up, but the howlers simply glared. Don't think you're off the hook because you took it down, one female in a purple shirt called out to him. Yeah, better stay out of dark alleys, said another. Frustrated, he turned to them, hands outstretched. I don't know what you're talking about. One howler turned to another. Short memory. That's a woofer for you. Hey. A male with a long lanyard full of buttons gestured to the two howlers. I'm glad MacDowell finally took the gloves off. It's about time. If I had my way, we'd. That's enough, my friends. Howard came down the hallway with Emma, his daughter-in-law, and Aidan, his son and heir to the alpha position. Emma, curvy blonde, was dwarfed by the Wers flanking her. Duncan finally had the two Wallace brothers straight in his mind. Aidan, who was now striding toward him, had brown hair and eyes that were almost golden. Rourke, who had blonde hair, was not with the others at the moment. The blog has been taken down, Howard said to the Wers standing in line. And I'm sure Duncan plans to make amends, don't you, Duncan? First I have to find out what I'm supposed to have done. Howard gave him a sharp glance. That wasn't quite the response I was looking for. Then he turned back to the lines of autograph seekers. I warn you, we can't have arguments breaking out during what's supposed to be a pleasant author event. The doors will open shortly. Please be civil to one another. He walked forward and held the door for Emma, Aidan, and Duncan. We need to talk, he said in a low voice as Duncan walked through the door. I'd like that very much. Maybe the mystery would finally be solved. He glanced to the front of the room where Kate had already ensconced herself at a table piled high with books. A petite brunette stood by her side, and he made a guess that was Heidi, her assistant. Howard motioned him toward the back of the room. I'll admit I was surprised and disappointed to see your blog this morning, he said. I thought you understood that inflaming the opposition wasn't going to help this organization function. I failed to see how my blog inflamed anyone. In fact, I was afraid that my followers would accuse me of pulling my punches. Howard studied him for a long moment. Then he sighed. I wondered if that's what had happened. What? I'm afraid somebody hacked into your blog, Duncan. They posted something really offensive, as if it had come from you. A trickle of cold sweat worked its way down Duncan's spine. Tell me about it. This morning, sometime before the end of the first round of seminars, your Blog post included a picture of Kate in bed with the TV star. He's on one of those cop shows. Emma would know it. Duncan's jaw dropped. No, it didn't. I don't know what blog you were looking at, but I'd sure as hell like to find out. That's outrageous. He trailed off. Is that what she thinks was on my blog too? She doesn't just think, Duncan. She knows. She saw it. We all did. There's no doubt it was your blog. It couldn't have been. Well, it was. A couple of us might have been mistaken, but when nearly all the convention delegates say they saw it, then it was there. And it was yours. Duncan swallowed. What else was on there? He listened in horror as Howard described the rest of the blog's contents. So you see why she was so upset, Howard said. Why we all were, except some of the woofers. I didn't do it. By all the saints, I didn't put up that blog. Duncan turned toward the front of the room. I have to go tell her. I can't let her think that I... Hold on a minute, son. Howard laid a heavy hand on his shoulder. I doubt she'll believe you, and you'll only cause more of a commotion. Duncan glanced back at him. Do you believe me? Yes, I do. But before you go trying to convince Kate or anyone about your innocence, let me put Aiden on the job. He handles security for Wallace Enterprises, and when it comes to something like this, he's the best. Let him nose around and find out what happened with your blog. Duncan scrubbed a hand over his face. I hate for her to go on thinking I would sabotage her like that. No wonder she wants me to burn in hell. Howard gave Duncan's shoulder a squeeze and stepped back. We'll get it fixed. Let me have a word with Aiden. Right now it's time to open those doors so you three can sign some books. Duncan walked up to the front of the room feeling like a condemned man. Going in front of the firing squad. An innocent condemned man at that. Kate glanced up once and then turned to talk with her assistant. His heart ached at the disdain he'd glimpsed in her blue eyes before she turned away. Her assistant didn't turn away though, and she had more than disdain in her eyes. Duncan would describe it as bloodlust. He didn't blame Heidi for that either. In fact, he was happy to know that Kate had such a loyal friend on her side. In Heidi's place, he'd feel the same. He'd want to kill whoever had hurt Kate. 3 rectangular tables had been lined up across the front of the room. Kate was on the far right and Duncan was on the far left. Emma sat at the middle table and she gave him a tight smile. Howard had already pulled Aiden over into a corner, leaving Emma alone at her table. He glanced at her and sighed. I didn't do it, Emma, he said as he walked around behind the table containing his name tent. Howard's asking your mate to investigate a potential blog hijacking. Some of the tenseness left Emma's expression. Really? You didn't put that up there? No, I didn't. And I wouldn't. That's not my way. I didn't think so either, but who would want to hijack your blog? I don't know. But he was already lining up suspects in his mind. Anyone who had reason to want the rivalry to continue had a motive. That included Jake, who pretended not to be much of a tech-savvy but that could be an act. Angela Sapworthy needed a steady supply of juicy stories to keep her readership. Besides those two, he wondered if any of his woofers might be that crazy. If Jake wasn't the culprit, then perhaps some other howler wanted to make sure that Kate didn't go soft on the woofers. Then he remembered that on Friday, someone had hacked into Kate's Fuhrervermer dating site. Although the doors had opened and delegates were pouring in, he quickly left his chair. Emma glanced at him in surprise. You can't leave, Duncan. Your fans are arriving. Please tell them I'll be right back. I have one more piece of information for Aiden. He covered the distance in a few long strides and spoke quickly with Aiden, who seemed glad to get more evidence that someone was up to no good in cyberspace. Don't worry, Aiden said. We'll figure this out. I hope so. I have a lot riding on it. He'd said that without thinking, but it was true. If he couldn't convince Kate that he would never knowingly do anything to hurt her, he'd carry that sorrow with him for the rest of his life. On that cheery note, he returned to the table to greet the first delegate in line to have a book autographed. He managed a smile and picked up his pen. For the next hour, he tried to focus on the steady stream of woofers who wanted a signed book as a souvenir. But his thoughts kept drifting to Kate sitting so near, yet so far away. Then he thought about Aiden and whether he'd learned anything yet. If Aiden was the Fast worker, maybe he'd be able to resolve the issue by the end of the hour. If not, the scheduled debate could be torture. But an hour wasn't a lot of time, and it was going fast. Kate wasn't having a good day. The shock of seeing Duncan's blog had shattered her composure. She'd fired off that response without thinking it through, and Grandma Elizabeth had not been pleased. She'd literally called Kate on the carpet over it, but at least the lecture had been a private one in Elizabeth's suite. Duncan's behavior was reprehensible, she'd said in words that still rang in Kate's ears, but you stooped to his level with your out-of-control response. A leader can't afford to have a hissy fit in public. Kate had wanted to argue that she had good reason for her hissy fit, but she knew her grandmother would be unmoved. She also knew her grandmother was right. After years of watching Grandma Elizabeth handle any crisis that came her way, and after recently observing Howard dealing with unruly delegates, she knew how she should have responded. Anger was fine so long as it was controlled and directed like a laser at the offending party. She'd spewed vitriol over the entire internet. She'd also sounded like a teenager when she'd added that part about hoping Duncan roasted in hell, saying it had felt oh so good but now it was everywhere, which felt oh so bad. She'd taken her response down but hadn't decided what to put in its place. After very little sleep last night, and not a whole lot more the night before, she was mentally and physically exhausted. She wasn't sure how she'd have survived the autograph session if Heidi hadn't been there giving her moral support. Most everyone who came to the table had some comment to make about Duncan's blog. The majority understood that the picture was fake, but a few didn't and wanted to know what that actor was like in person. I don't know, she'd answer each time the question came up. I've never met him. The were would look confused. But the picture was a fake. He and I have never been in the same room together, let alone the same bed. Oh, the questioner usually left looking vaguely disappointed. You'd think they'd be more concerned about you abandoning your principles to sleep with the guy, Heidi muttered. I guess if the human's a celebrity then all bets are off. How much longer until we're done here? We're almost there. Kate couldn't even rejoice in that, because her debate with Duncan started. After a short break between events, she grabbed spare minutes to speed read the rest of his book, but she hadn't laughed at any of his attempts to be funny this time. For all she knew, he'd made up every story he told anyway. She felt like such a fool as she remembered all the times she'd complimented him on his integrity. Yeah, right. And yet, while she hated him with a white-hot passion, she couldn't stop thinking about him sitting over there only 1 6-foot table away from her. She'd noticed his little confab with Howard before the event started and assumed Howard had read him the riot act. Yet Duncan had made no move to speak to her, no attempt to apologize for his egregious behavior. Not that she would accept his apology, but now that he'd been forced to take down that blog, he must realize what an ass he'd made of himself by putting it up. Well, good. Let him suffer. If he was too proud to apologize for what he'd done, then she'd mark that down in her growing list of his sins. And when they had their debate, she would do her very best to eviscerate him. In a classy way, of course, so Grandma Elizabeth wouldn't give her another lecture. She wanted his blood on the floor, if not literally, then figuratively. That looks like the last of them, Heidi said. Kate tossed down her pen. Then I'm going to disappear into the ladies' room. For 5 minutes. I need a moment. You bet. Heidi gave her a quick smile. I'll tidy up here and haul out your notes for the debate. Go take a few calming breaths so you can come back and kick his ass. You know it, girlfriend. Leaving her chair, Kate headed for the nearest exit. From the corner of her eye, she saw Duncan get up and she moved faster. She did not want to deal with him now. Unfortunately, he had longer legs than she did and he beat her to the door. Kate, please listen for a minute. I don't care to listen. She avoided his gaze. Now please move so I can take a bathroom break. It wasn't me, Kate. I didn't put that blog up there. I don't know who did. But Aiden is looking into it. Rage gripped her and she finally looked into his eyes. Of course you put it up there. Her chest tightened and she had trouble breathing, but she wasn't going to let him wiggle out of this disaster by claiming he'd been the victim of a hacker. After last night you had all the information about Penny, and on Friday night I conveniently mentioned my crush on the guy who stars in The Force. My picture's on my blog and I'm sure his picture is everywhere on the internet. Pain flashed in his gray eyes. I didn't do it. I would never deliberately try to hurt you, Kate. You seem sincere enough, but then so do all psychopaths. Everyone thought Ted Bundy was a nice guy too. Kate. My God. How can you say something that horrible, lass? How could you put that picture on your blog, Duncan? And then drag my sister's name into it? How could you? Unshed tears made her eyes ache, and if she stood here much longer she was liable to cry. Damned if she'd let him see that. Either you move or I'm calling for help to physically move you. I'm sure I could find several howlers who would love to do that. I'm sure you could. He moved aside. But search your heart, Kate. You're a good judge of character. You didn't misjudge me before, but you're doing so now. I wish that were true. She hurried past him and out the door before his soft, low voice could seduce her into believing in him again. He'd fooled her once, but he wouldn't fool her a second time.